Hey everyone, I have another encounter story or a story from my sheriff's department friend. Here we go. The call originated from our local 911 center, which is located in the county sheriff's office. The caller was speaking Spanish and our dispatcher only speaks English. We have two officers on staff who speak Spanish. One of those officers happened to be in the compound that late June night catching up on paperwork. He put on the headphones to listen in and translate and direct the call. The officer knew this was a bad one right away. The caller was screaming into the phone, begging for help, begging for us to send cars. He just kept saying, send cars, we need help. Loud noises could be heard in the background, and then there were several gunshots. She needed an address because the call was coming in from a pay-by-the-minute mobile phone, and in those days we could not locate the signal. Finally, the officer said to the caller in a loud but calm voice, ¿Dónde estás? The caller replied, Browns Road. So the officer said, Okay, ¿Quién tiene las armas? Or, who is shooting the guns? The caller was gone for a minute, so the officer repeated the question. 30 seconds later, the response was, Debemos defendernos, or we are defending ourselves. The officer immediately replied, We have cars on the way. You have to put your guns down when the cars arrive. Tienes que llevar tus armas ahora. The caller seemed to calm down and say, Deprisa, por favor, vámonos, por favor, el monstruo está aquí. The officer and the dispatcher looked at each other. She spoke enough Spanish to understand what the caller had just said. Hurry, a monster is attacking us. When they returned their attention to the call, the line was dead. After several attempts to recall the number, someone finally picked up, and it was a child. Ayúdame, me estoy escondiendo de la bestia. I am hiding from the monster. Please help me. Then they heard banging and more commotion, more gunfire. There was a fight happening in that house. The child could not respond, and the dispatcher assumed that the child had laid the phone down or dropped it. Deputies normally ride solo in their cars in this county, but on this night I had a fellow officer with me. He was a member of our narcotics team, and when he heard the location of the call, he knew exactly where this house was. It was a single-wide trailer parked at the end of a newly bulldozed road out in the county. It was a perfect spot for a meth lab. It was a lab noticed by recent flyovers, and our narcotics team had been watching it for the last 2 weeks. They had a 2-man team posted 150 yards behind the house in the woods to watch the trailer, but that team had been taken off the stakeout to move to another case for 2 nights. It had been confirmed that this was a meth lab, and they were going to take it down the next week. We also had undercover guys following the shipments, hoping to make more arrests when we pulled the trigger on the operation. It was a well-established cash machine back in the woods, and it was not going anywhere. I will not describe our methods of approaching a large drug operation like this. We don't want the bad guys to know that we know what they are doing. However, we were able to approach the house within an hour. We disarmed and arrested everyone we could find. When we hit a house like this out in the woods, we know several of the suspects will take off into the woods and try to escape. No one ran. They were all standing in plain view as we approached the house. Their weapons were laid neatly in front of the group, and they all stood sweating in the heat of the night with their hands in the air. They were almost glad to see us. Prior to approaching the house, we had positioned several teams out and about the perimeter to catch those trying to flee. When the tense moments were over and those guys were free to move about and come in to help us process the area, they began calling in on the radio that they had bodies in the woods. Not a shot had been fired since we entered the area. The sheriff was asking over the radio what was the apparent cause of death. He wanted to know that his men were not walking into an ambush with armed men who had been placed in the woods before the pandemonium had broken out with the 911 call. The officers in the field were only saying that he needed to see it before they broadcast it over the radios. The sheriff and 2 officers began walking into the woods surrounding the house. My team was to secure the immediate area surrounding the trailer, so once we had our suspects in cuffs and loaded into the van, we began making a search around the trailer. Another team was inside the house and would be taking inventory of all the evidence they could find. As I rounded the corner to the back of the house, I could not believe what I was seeing. The whole back of the trailer was ripped apart, walls torn off and thrown into the yard. I could clearly see the interior of the trailer from one end to the other. Some of the debris was inside the house, which looked like the walls had been caved in from the outside, and some was in the yard as if something had torn walls out once it had a handhold on the walls. The scene reminded me of how a trailer looks after a tornado. An officer with the team inside the trailer got the generator started that had been the power source for the whole operation, and exterior floodlights that were still attached to the eave of the back of the house illuminated the area. There were 2 bodies laying just into the woods. They both lay in vines and brush in contorted positions. We checked for signs of life, but it was not there. One of the dead men looked like he had been doubled over backwards, his back obviously broken, and the position he was left in haunts my dreams still. The other's body was laying at the base of a tree. The only way we could see how he got in that position was for someone or something to have slammed him into the tree trunk while holding his feet, folding him into a horseshoe shape, and then letting him drop to the ground. The officers and the sheriff out in the woods were finding the bodies out there in similar positions. Daylight finally gave us a better view of the area, and we searched most of the day for evidence in the woods. Each body had a weapon laying close by. Several spent brass cartridges were found close to all of the bodies. We had no reason to think that they were shooting at each other. They seemed to be defending themselves from something. By noon the next day, everything had been bagged and tagged. The 8 individuals we had arrested had been taken to the county jail for processing, and the bodies had been delivered to the coroner's office for inspection. Later, we hoped we would find a reasonable explanation on how they died. None had a single gunshot wound. They had all been, crushed to death by something. We didn't know what. Around 3 p.m., the truck arrived to take away what was left of the single-wide trailer. The driver spent an hour hooking everything up and then drove off down the muddy road that led to the meth lab. We were done with this job. There were 4 of us left at the scene, and we were loading our gear into our cars when, as I slammed the trunk lid down, a small child appeared at the edge of the woods, in my view, over the top of the car. It was a little girl around the age of 11 or 12. I walked over to her. I kneeled down and asked if this is where she lived. "See," she said, looking up at my face. I asked her if she saw what had happened here last night. "See," she said. I do not speak Spanish well, but I asked her, "Hablar inglés?" She said, "Yes, very little." "Okay, tell me in English what happened here last night." She began to tremble, and I could tell it was hard for her to get the words out. Then she said, "Javier shot at a man in the forest. Then the big man chased him. I ran away to hide." I took her hand and led her to my squad car. I placed her in the front seat and shut the door while my partner rode in the back seat. I wanted her to feel comfortable and not like she was being arrested. As we drove out on the muddy road, she started repeating a phrase in Spanish. "Un monstruo estuvo aquí anoche. Era un monstruo." A monster came here last night. It was a monster. It was a monster. There is no official cause of death to this day for the bodies that we found, but I'm pretty sure I know what it was.